snake draft strategy, how to use ADPs, and a deep dive into undervalued catchers. Erik Halterman of RotoWire joins us next on Beat the Shift. And welcome to another episode of the Beat the Shift podcast. I am your host, Ariel Cohen, and with me as always is Ruvain Guy. How you doing, Ruvain?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. Getting into the nitty-gritty of fantasy baseball analysis, ATC projections. Well, actually, by the time this comes out, this podcast, it'll either be out or really close. So very excited. ATC getting ready. It's been a nice journey this year, and always really fun to see when it drops.
Yep, and pitchers and catchers, I think, report within the month, so that's also always exciting. But there's still so many free agents still out there. It does hurt us a little bit in the fantasy world because we don't know where everyone is playing.
Absolutely. Well, we've got a great episode today. We're going to get into our position preview where we give the ATC undervalued players. Today's episode is going to be the catcher episode, but as always, we start with some strategy. And on to join us from RotoWire and from SiriusXM and MLB, it's Erik Halterman. What's going on, Erik?
Hi, Ariel. Nice to be joining you. I was just listening to your auction strategy podcast right before this one, so a lot of pressure to put out an equally good snake draft podcast today. Otherwise, we're going to have everybody playing auctions this year. Nobody's ever going to snake draft ever again.
A great man once said, pressure makes diamonds. So there you go.
There we go.
Yeah.
Or
podcasts.
Dust.
Anybody know where that comes from, that line?
No.
The Odyssey.
No. It was a show that I used to watch actually from Canada. It was called Being Erica. And the doctor on that would always say these lines. And he said that once, pressure makes diamonds.
So I was pretty close then.
Yeah,
Almost
actually, yeah, not too bad. We have a lot of Canadian people listening to the show. Maybe they've heard of it. If you have, drop us a line. It would be really interesting to hear that. But we did auction strategy in our previous episode. We're going to tackle some snake draft strategy. And to prepare you for that, so I'll just throw it out to you first, Erik. How should you prepare for just very generally, for your fantasy baseball draft? What kind of tools and resources do you use, and how should you structure yourself?
Well, it's going to be not that different from all the tips that you shared on how to prepare for an auction draft. I mean, the core of it is you need a list of how you value players, and you need a list of how you think everyone else is going to value players. That first one, the list of how you rank players, is the most important, and ideally, I think, if you're able to put in the work and you think you have the knowledge, it should be your own rankings, which are based off of other people's rankings and projections and auction calculators and that sort of thing. But if that's not the level of player you're at, or you just don't have the time for that, I think using trusted source, a ranker whose opinions you tend to agree with and think are pretty good, or a projection system fed through an auction calculator like ATC, you just need something. If it's your own list, then you're going to be sticking to it very closely throughout the draft. And if it's a list that you know you're leaning on somebody else's work from, then you should feel free to deviate from it a little bit more. But you need something that says this is the order I like all these guys. Then you need something that says this is the order I think the rest of the room is going to pick these guys in, which is going to be ADP in some form. But ideally, a more recent, more specific ADP, depending on what service you're playing on. The draft room's ADP might be showing you all drafts on that site, and it might be showing you all drafts from all winter, and that's going to really miss on some key guys. So if you're, for example, playing on NFBC, and you can use their ADP filter to just the types of contests you're playing in just over the last, say, 2 weeks or something like that, you'll have a leg up on people who are just looking at the in-room ADP. So that's the main one. Just have some sort of list, ideally your own that you put a lot of work into yourself, and have some sort of list that you think everybody else is going to be approximately working off of. Once you got those two, you're at a good place to start.
Those are the basics. Ruvain, anything to add?
Yeah, I would add one thing that make sure you have a plan based on where you're drafting in the draft. I mean, you can see the ADP. The ADP is great, but if you're drafting in the, let's say, in the first part of the draft or the second or the middle, you have to know where the ADP lands each round for you and who to expect in each area. So if you have an idea of which player lands in each area, you can basically help start to build your own team in your head and have an idea who to pick when the time comes.
I'd say to add in, more importantly, you got to take a look in the draft where your rankings deviate the most from the market's rankings. If you have a couple of players at the first base position in the 10th round that are going in the 10th round that you believe are in the 7th round, oh boy, that's a spot where you might want to pick up a first baseman. I call that a hot spot. If you've got 3 first basemen and they're interchangeable, wow, then you know that if you wait till the 10th round, you'll get somebody who you value as a 7th rounder. So you want to create a strategy based on pockets of hot spots where you think that you've got an undervalued player at a certain position or at a certain statistic. You might find a couple of steals in the 11th round that you think are going 2 rounds below where they should. That's a nice pocket to pick up some steals. And when you find the pockets and you find it all over, you can put up a plan to put it together, and then you draft the first couple of rounds to complement that hot spot. That's my general strategy for doing the snake. Erik, is there any way that you prepare for a draft these days than what you did maybe 5 years ago?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think for myself, one of the biggest changes in my fantasy drafting is that I'm doing more drafts earlier in the off season, partly because at RotoWire, I want to be able to offer good advice to the people who are starting their drafts in late February. So that means I got to have a good handful of drafts done by that point, starting as early as October. I'm not yet one of those people who starts last August, but we'll see. And the way that I think you have to prepare for those early off-season drafts is different than the later ones, because in the early off-season, you only have a few projection systems out, and crucially, you don't have ATC, which is my favorite. I think it may well be yours as well. If you're doing a draft pre-ATC season, you're looking at Steamer, maybe a few others, and certainly is useful as a check on your own intuitions, but I don't find it to be as useful as I find ATC. I think ATC, because it looks at a whole bunch of different projections, it's going to sort of weed out the areas where one projection is a specific outlier. And if you're only looking at one projection early in the season, then you're going to draft like Steamer, and Steamer's mistakes are going to become your mistakes. Now, of course, early in the offseason, if you're relying a little bit less on those and more on your own hunches, that's not necessarily better. You're just going to make your own sort of mistakes. But certainly I've had to figure out how to draft in a pre-ATC world now that I've been doing more of these November, December, January drafts. Yeah, in a lot of ways. I've been doing one of the first pitch Arizona drafts for the first time this past fall. That was really a naked experience because there you don't even have ADP. The ADP in the room is last year's ADP, and I was rather worried going into that draft. Are all my intuitions just going to be wrong? I have an order for when I think guys should be going, but am I going to take everybody several rounds too early because the rest of the room doesn't feel that way? Am I passing up on a ton of bargains that aren't there yet? So it's a different game in those early drafts, and for me, that involves just, looking more at the kinds of things the projections are eventually going to pick up on, all the underlying numbers, the aging curves, that sort of thing. But I think it does leave me susceptible to my own biases. I think I probably will overrate, for example, guys who popped in barrel rate just last year, but didn't do so for the last several years. That would be the sort of player that would stand out to me when I'm just looking at it myself. But the projection systems, once ATC comes along, I take a little bit more of a measured look at things and say, okay, yes, well, he popped for 1 year, but most guys in the past who popped for 1 year like this fell back in the second season. So I think that I'm trying to learn how to draft in that pre-ADC world, doing more naked drafts, as you said. Not yet literally as part of my draft prep, but maybe that's the next step.
I didn't know that we were going to talk about naked drafts on this show here, but it's a family show, man. But I get what you're saying. By the way, RotoWire is going to be having once again ATC on the site, and I think this year, I think they are building the tools to have in the actual draft software where you can actually put ATC in. Do you know if that's true yet?
Yeah, that's my understanding. Especially,
Yeah,
definitely the Apple draft software in particular. It may be everywhere by the
perfect.
time you're listening to this. Yeah, we were very excited to get ATC on the site. Last year it was up on the player pages and a few other places, but we're hoping to integrate it. Planning, we are integrating it throughout the site much more this year. So if you want to be, should we say, extra clothed and put on extra layers I'm stretching the metaphor here, but if you want to be rather warm, we've got ATC over at RotoWire in places this year to help you out.
Well, let's take the metaphor a little farther. Let's say you want to put on a hat and gloves. Maybe you want to do a deep dive in the ADP that's available right now. See which categories are being pushed up. Are steals being pushed off again this year? Are closers going to be at a premium? Are starting pitchers dropping down a little bit? There's a way to see how the market's in the very beginning. You can see how the market is trending and maybe get an idea of how you're going to do it based on that.
So I wanted to say a couple of things to respond to what you were saying, Eric. Also, is well, first of all, I don't do any drafts without ATC. I mean, it's a big thing. I'm cool with drafting in January, but Ruvain, should we do a go on NFBC and do like one auction before ATC is published, just to beat the market? Should we do that?
That's an idea, but that would mean it have to be done like very, very soon, and I don't think that's going to happen.
All right, because of our schedules, but
Yes, schedules don't work.
yeah, theoretically we should do that, right? Now I do want to say something about early drafts, though. Um, it's funny because when you're playing an overall contest on the NFBC, you think, is it better to draft early or late? And there's reasons to do either. To draft late, you have more certainty on roles. Players have all pretty much signed. You have some position battles being won. You have closers more certain, and sometimes managers will actually clue in who the closer is. You don't have that certainty in January. But the opposite, because you don't have that certainty, you can actually get bigger bargains. Bigger bargains are possible. If you somehow throw a late dart on a closer and that turns out to be the guy you didn't realize because somebody got injured, well, you just got $1 and you can pick up a 30 save guy potentially. Or you can get a guy before he signs with the team. Usually the prices are depressed a little bit, and there you go, you can sign him. Or a guy who's about to have a great spring training, and you've discovered him before. You can get that before that player gains helium. So I would actually think, and I saw this at First Pitch Arizona. I think Rob DiPietro pointed out that some of the overall teams that win are actually the teams that draft pretty early on because they can get these bargains. Of course, when you're drafting a solo league against your own, the same people in your league, sure, I mean, it doesn't matter. Everyone's in the same boat. But when you're drafting in an overall contest, and there's contests that start in January, maybe even November, who knows, through all the way through March, there could be an advantage or disadvantage. What do you think, Eric?
Yeah, I would think if you're trying to spike an overall win, that doing the early drafts would be smart. I think your average finish isn't necessarily going to be higher, and you're going to have some duds that are really duds if you draft them in November. But I think of it similarly to, say, if a player breaks a record. Well, usually what happens is they had a really good season, they did everything right, and they got some lucky breaks. If you just have a really good season, then, you hit 55 homers. But if you're hitting 73, it's because some other things went well as well. I think it's similar to that when it comes to trying to win an overall contest. Imagine 3 different drafters, both of whom did everything right. One of them drafted late, so there wasn't much room for random variance. The other 2 drafted early. One of them had positive variance and the other had negative variance. Well, guess what? It's the early drafter with the added advantage of positive variance who's going to finish the highest of those 3, even though the late drafter also did everything right. And on average, they're going to do as well as the average early drafter. They still beat the person who had the negative variance. But look, if you're trying to finish first out of several hundred, it's more than just doing things right yourself. You also need a little bit of good fortune, and I think there are more opportunities for good fortune to come your way if you're drafting early.
Let's see if we're promoting NFBC for everybody to get on the bandwagon and draft now as opposed to March. Let's see if we help out Greg there. So there you go. When you are preparing, who you're going to pick and your rankings and stuff, do you ever prepare, Eric, a do not draft list where you say, just I'm not drafting this guy, forget it, don't touch him? Or maybe on the opposite side, do you prepare I'm only drafting from this list, and it's going to be some 20% of the player pool. I'm not touching anybody else but the guys on my list. Do you ever do something like that?
I myself don't, but I wouldn't necessarily advise the listeners not to do it because I know that some strong drafters do and have a lot of success with that. For myself, in theory, I could still be the highest person in the room on a player I don't like, so might as well keep them on my board, right? If I think that a guy who's normally going in the 6th round really is a 9th rounder and the rest of the room has him as an 11th rounder, I should probably take him in the 9th round. I think I'm still passing value there, even if I don't like the player at his draft price. So I don't see a lot of value in straight up removing players, unless maybe it's a psychological value that where you know that you are likely to make decisions you're later going to regret. I don't know, maybe you, in the cold light of day, would never draft Mike Trout, but then you're coming to your pick, and man, Mike Trout's been sitting at the top of the ADP list for a couple rounds, and you know that there's too much injury risk. You don't want to take him. You don't draft like that, but man, he's there. And if you consider yourself somebody who makes picks that you'd later regret in a moment of weakness or something like that, then sure, create a do not draft list. But I think most of the time, you want to be reacting to what the room gives you, and if you take someone off your board, then in that rare circumstance where everyone else is even more out on him, well, then you've, I think, hurt yourself.
You ever do that, Ruvain? I mean, like, are you going to touch DeGrom or Sale with the 10-foot pole this year?
There is a price for every player. It depends how much risk you want to take and whether or not you want to take these injured players. I think you should go into every draft with an open mind, saying there's really nobody that's off limits at the right value. If they're not at your value, then you can just leave them, let someone else take that risk. Like you mentioned, Mike Trout. If you're nervous that his knees are gonna bark this year and he's gonna have a bunch of issues with that, or maybe he's gonna have a down year because the Eagles don't win the Super Bowl, whatever it may be. You may not want to stick with a person in a certain round, but you may take him. Okay, you don't want to take DeGrom in the 2nd round or the 3rd round, but if DeGrom is still sitting there in the 4th, 5th round, and he's just sitting there, and all the pitchers already below him have gone, and no one wants to take that risk, there is a point when you can say, you know what? Why not? The value is there, and if you're getting enough cents on the dollar for a certain value, then I think there's no problem with drafting people like that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you're gonna risk. I put it my mathematical terms. You're gonna risk adjust the prices. Everyone can be bought at a price, but I think there is a notion, and especially for pitchers, because I think with hitters, if you have a bad year, they're not going to zero. Or if they get injured, it's usually a 6-week injury, 8-week injury. They're not going to be out for the year in most scenarios. For pitchers, you could have a binary injury or risk where they just turn out to be a 6 ERA pitcher and then they're out for the year. So I think there is a threshold for pitchers where you say, okay, I'll only do it if it's a quote low investment, and that low could be like literally 20th round. Fine. If it's utterly free or basically free, $2, $3 at the bottom, sure, I'll take that risk, but otherwise not, because of the binary nature of the pitcher's risks. I can see that happening. There's never for me a do not draft. It's just you got to be just, I don't know what kind of scenario would have to be just almost free. I can see that happening for me. By the way, are you guys taking DeGrom or right now they're going 3rd round in the NFBC? Are you guys taking DeGrom or Sale? Even though their projections are showing something somewhat similar, they're not saying stay away.
I have not yet, in the early drafts that I've done, looked in either of those directions, and I think that you're probably better off just getting some hitters that you can trust to stay on your roster at that point. I guess the question is, if you're afraid of pitching early, then of course you're going to be afraid of the particularly injury-prone pitchers. And then the question is, should you be jumping other pitchers up ahead of them, or if you're out on DeGrom and Sale, does that actually mean that you're just out on pitching in general early because you think pitchers are too likely to break and, like you said, miss the full season? I don't totally know the answer to that question.
Well, if you're planning your roster a certain way where you want to take some risk early on and they're dropping, I could see myself taking DeGrom in the 4th round if I think my team construct is good. If I'm comfortable, my first three picks are all hitters, and DeGrom is still sitting there in the beginning of the 4th round or something like that. I don't see why not. I've been burned by DeGrom in the past, and I had Sale last year, and Sale was pretty good, and there's really no reason why he wouldn't do this. Not exactly 100% repeat from last year, but if you get 80% or 90% of what he was last year, he did miss a big chunk of time. So it's yes, he has a lot of mileage on that arm, and I'm not too concerned about injury because he is injury prone, but his injuries are like more like freak injuries, I would say, like dirt bike stuff like that maybe. But I think DeGrom I'm willing to stomach a little bit more. Sale I don't want to take a picture that high in general, so that's why I think I'd wait a little bit.
Welcome to the Madison Bumgarner Academy. What was
Exactly.
Madison Bumgarner's alias that he did in the derbies? What was it? Was it Mason something?
Mason
Something?
Saunders.
Mason
Mason
Saunders.
Saunders.
There you go.
That's a good trivia question right there.
I knew it was Mason because I knew it had the same name as Justin Mason. Couldn't remember his last name.
That's funny.
All right, so I want to ask the question about the proactive versus the relative approach, because you can play a draft and you can go and say, all right, I'm going to get the guys I want, and there you go. Or you can go and say, let's play the room. Do you want to play the ADP chicken where you say, okay, well, I know my value for this guy is 7th round. He ain't going for the 12th round, so I'm not going to pick him in the 7th. I'm not going to pick him in the 8th. How far do you push that? Let's get my guys versus let's play chicken and let's wait for ADP to come. There's a balance, I think. But what are your thoughts on that, Eric, on how you balance the proactive versus relative approach?
Yeah, I think I definitely stay much more on the reactive side of things. I think there's some drafters, I think Ruvain and maybe you, Ariel, maybe one as well, but based on what Ruvain was saying earlier about, looking several rounds ahead, that is one approach where you start even during your KDS, even during when you're selecting your position in the draft, you've already have some sort of idea of, well, I like the middle this year because I can get this guy, this guy, this guy in rounds 4, 5, and 6. Or I like the end because I really like this pairing in rounds 3 and 4, something like that. I don't do that nearly as much. I want to be in a position where I can take whatever the room's giving me that day, and there can be a whole bunch of axes that the room is hot or cold on. Maybe this is a room that is taking hitters early. Maybe it's a room that's taking starting pitchers early. Maybe they're hot or cold on saves. Maybe they're hot or cold on steals. Maybe they're, I think this is a common one, hot or cold on risk in general. There's some rooms where everyone seems fine taking DeGrom. He's going ahead of his ADP, as is Chris Sale, as is Mike Trout, etc. There's some rooms where all those guys fall multiple rounds. And I think if you enter a draft room saying, I'm the guy who's not taking any risks this draft, or I'm the guy who's going to start pocket aces, it might work. And I think it's possible that the very best fantasy players do come in with a specific plan that they've cracked their league settings. I think certainly if you're in an unconventional league and you're one of the strongest players in it, maybe you can crack the settings and say, I'm going to do this weird thing no matter what everyone else does. But for me, I want to leave rounds 3 to 5 ready to go in multiple different directions based on what the room's doing. If the room is not taking pitchers and I ended up with more starters than I expected, I think by default these days with starting pitchers getting injured more than ever, I'm leaning more towards hitters in the first 2-3 rounds than I used to. But if everyone else in this room is doing that even more, I don't think I want to play their same game, a worse version of it. I think I want to play the other game. I want to say, all right, I guess this is my team with pocket aces. And I think that for myself, the way that I can be a better player is just having drafted all different sorts of teams a few times and being comfortable knowing, okay, if I started without much speed, here are the speed targets I like late. I know that I have to go get them, but I know that I can get them. Or if I started with no starting pitchers for the first 6, 7 rounds, this is what it looks like after that. So I think for myself, the approach that I want to have in most drafts is be ready to do whatever the rest of the room doesn't want to do.
Okay, your take, Ruvain?
I want to be a little both proactive and reactive. I want to be reactive in the fact exactly what Eric said. Follow, not necessarily follow the lead of what's going on in the room or get a feel of what's going on in the room. But I don't mind being proactive either. I don't mind being the first or second, player in the draft to get a catcher or to get a closer. I don't mind being the first one to do that. I don't mind being a little bit, I want to. I want to be in the position where I am starting a run as opposed to being toward the middle or the ends of a run. Because if you're starting a run, that means you timed everything perfectly, and everyone's following your lead, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's actually the better way to go, because if you're more reactive and you're always reactive, you end up being at the end of runs. You end up missing the players that you want, and you end up reaching or paying more than what their value is at their certain spot.
Yeah, the runs thing is very different than auction. And, when we play auction, you never get caught in these, quote, runs, where it's harder to get caught because you're involved in every player. If I'm picking, in the 14th spot, it's hard not to, if you really jump the scarce position runs, you could be out of luck for a certain tier of a certain run, catchers or closers or whatnot. So it's very, very different. There is a balance, as I mentioned, between proactive and relative. I do want to say about the KDS, though, Eric. I actually do not have a plan and say, well, I like the 12th spot because I can get this. I actually don't do that. I actually prefer whatever it is, unless the first two rounds are glaringly, oh my God, picking third is such an advantage. I will pick the middle by default. Because A, I won't get caught in the runs. B, I get more information when I make decisions. It's also better for my value game because I don't have to go more than 15 picks before another selection, where if you're on an end, you could go a range of 30 picks without a selection, right? You get more control of picking somebody for value if you're picking more often than just picking two at once, where two at once, you're doing it to fill needs more. When you're picking in the middle, you're picking more for value, and that plays to my game more. But yeah, in general, you have to be able to play the room and say, listen, the room is not valuing pitching. I can now react to that and know that I can get pitching a little bit later. Or maybe I change it up and say, okay, they didn't at this point. Well, so there's a lot of pitchers in the market. I'm going to take a pitcher now. Then everyone's going to come back for pitching, and then I'll grab my hitter later, right? There's different ways to play what goes on in the room. But if you don't adapt to the room, you will be left behind. I want to ask you, Eric, how do you use ADPs? I know a lot of people use it differently. Some people say, well, I'm just going to follow ADP or similar. How do you, or do you use ADP? I know you do, but what context do you use ADPs when you're evaluating what to take and when?
Yeah, I'm always surprised when people talk about how unimportant ADP is. I think that's crazy. I think that ADP is what sets the terms of the draft, essentially. And the way that you win a draft is correctly being better than ADP, but also using ADP to know when you have to pick a player. It's a very common situation that, you're in the 9th round and the top guy on your board has an ADP in round 12. Well, that's the key decision you have to make in a fantasy draft is, do I take my guy who I have a 9th round value on in the 9th round? Do I take him in the 10th? Do I take him in the 11th? Or do I wait all the way to the 12th? And getting that right is, I think, the key decision in a fantasy draft and a lot of the fun. Because, hey, if you just grab him in the 9th round, then you're pairing him with a 12th round player, and you haven't actually made any profit, even if you're right that he's a 9th round value.
You certainly can't do that for every player. I mean, imagine if you did that for every player and just said, I'm just going to take the top guy on my board. You're going to pick players way earlier than they would have, and you're losing value on the table. So whether it's maybe there's one key player that you just got to get, and all right, I'm going to push him, at some point. But if you do that for every player, you're going to screw yourself. You're not getting the most value.
Exactly. And the game is getting the most value. It's not just getting this one player who you really like. You want to get him and a whole bunch of other players who you also like. And so I think correctly waiting long enough in this game of ADP chicken, as we might call it, is, I think, key to being a good drafter. Now, there are different types of ADP chicken you might need to play here. For example, the basic type is just when you're way higher on a guy than the market. I think that's the simple case. You can look at his ADP. You can look at your ranking. They're several rounds different Usually I end up maybe grabbing the guy about 1 round early in that case, because there's chances are somebody else in the room also likes him, but is probably also going to wait. Maybe you need to go a little bit more than that, but something like that. But then there's also players like a buzzy player that you just suspect, 3 or 4 other players on the room probably like him too. That's a much tougher call. There's also, for example, players whose ADP is outdated. I think of Matt Shaw of the Cubs earlier this offseason. He was going quite late in the initial drafts, but when the Cubs traded Isaac Paredes away, and they didn't announce that Shaw was taking his place, but it sure looked like he would be, then everybody who's plugged in that room knows that Matt Shaw's ADP is off by several hundred picks, but there isn't really a new one yet, and I think that is a particularly tough one, and I don't totally know the answer there. I think with a player like him, you have to be comfortable realizing that you're just going to miss him sometimes. Somebody else might just jump him way earlier than you think, and you just have to be fine with that because the other players who are going in that round are also totally fine.
But you can't also live and die by the ADP either. You have to understand that you want to get the top value, but sometimes the top value is not necessarily a good fit for your team. Like, let's say you pick a corner in the first round, you pick another corner in the second round that just happens to be where the value is, and then the top value guy for the third round is a corner. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to go by it. That doesn't, if the top ADP says it's going to be an outfielder, but you still have value at the corner, what do you do there? Do you go with your value? Do you go with ADP? I think in that aspect, I think it's more based on where your team is and what you need for the team construct. Now, yes, you have to try to get as much value as possible. I understand that, and you can put them in a corner, and I understand everything else, but you're going to be sacrificing in other aspects of your team if you go just strictly by your own rankings or by the ADP itself.
Yeah, here's how I use ADP. Well, first of all, I use it in the planning process to find the pockets of where I think that there could be values. Oh, there's a lot of undervalued first basemen in the 11th round. Okay, so that means, up top, maybe I don't take a first baseman. So it allows me to plan better, right? So that's number one. During the draft, though, I would say that the first few rounds, 4 or 5 rounds, I don't look at ADP as I'm doing the draft. I think that I'm taking either the best player of value or, more importantly, the best player with unique abilities or a broad base of stats to position me later on to compile the best team. Right? If you pick Julio Rodriguez, is going to give you a broad base of stuff, then your draft can go either way, and you can get more value picks later. If you're picking an Ellie De La Cruz, great guy, but later on it's harder to construct because you need to push more homers and RBIs later if possible, right? I want to take guys who I think are going to help my team and, of course, of the best value early on. So I won't even look at ADP. I'm looking at just what's the best construct. At the very end of the draft, with the last few rounds, I also ignore ADP. It doesn't really matter if I think a guy is in the 18th round, but you think he's in the 25th round. I'm taking my guy at that point, right? The difference between the 18th round and the 23rd round is like $1 or $1.50. So, yeah, I'll jump my guy 5 rounds, but 5 rounds at that level is $1.50. So I'm taking my guy, right? It's the middle of the draft where you have to know where are the pockets of ADP that are undervalued. Okay, how big is the discrepancy between my pick and the other guy? And you have to play a little bit of ADP chicken, as we said, or you'll never get the value. So I am looking. It's not the do-all, end-all, but it is a little bit of a guide in the middle of the draft. Not at the top and bottom. Top and the bottom, I'm ignoring it pretty much.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I definitely agree on the end, too. Just looking at an old Rotographs article here by Alex Chamberlain that has some of those values in front of me. He's got $2 for round 23, 24, 25, $1 after that. If you're in an auction and you pay $2 for a player you had as a $1 value, you barely even remember that you did that. I think that's just a thing that you have to do sometimes, that the auction dynamics push you that way. And this is really saying that's a difference of 5-6 rounds. So if you're in round 22 and there's a guy who's projected to be picked in round 28, you should feel totally fine just grabbing him now.
Totally.
It's inconsequential. I mean, what's the difference between a player worth $2.2 on your thing over a player that's worth 1.8? It's nothing. It's a matter of team construct at that point.
Yeah, exactly. Let's talk a little bit about risk before we move on to catchers. How do you incorporate risk into your roster construction, Eric? So, I mentioned that I do risk adjust prices, but do you actually take the prices and change it, meaning like you'll knock down the round pick that you would do for somebody, or maybe it's an overall aggregate feel for your team? Like, okay, I'll take 2 risky players, but not anymore. So if I take a risky guy, okay, I won't take another risky guy later, right? There's different ways to do it. There's on an individual basis the risk and change the round. There's, or or maybe in your projection you'll drop the at bats and recalculate, that kind of thing. Or you're just looking to limit for your roster construction. Like, how do you approach it?
Yeah, definitely on both sides there. I wouldn't say that I do it in a very formal, precise way, and I wonder how much. I mean, it sounds like you do a rather formal way, and so probably you do get some benefit from that. I just wonder my ability to be particularly precise about what the risks are seems like it's probably not that high. So trying to come up with a number, like, could I confidently give, Jacob deGrom has a 75% chance of having an IL stint this year, and Chris Sale's at 72%. So I'm going to knock off this much off of deGrom's projection and this much off of Sale. I just don't think I can do that precisely enough. So what I usually end up doing is when I build my rankings, I'm doing tiered rankings by position before I turn them into something that goes into the RotoWire Roundtable rankings. And those tiers, it's usually going to be a tier of guys with, A+ talent and A+ health. And then after that, it's the guys with A+ talent and bad health. And then we move on to the guys with A talent and A+ health, and then A talent and bad health. So usually it's just a separate tier where I will just kind of say, these guys are big risks. Move them all collectively down from the rest of their peers in terms of talent. And I really am not putting a precise number on there and seeing where it comes out to in the calculator, because, you could be correct that Jacob deGrom is a very big injury risk, but you could project him for, 80 innings and he gets 30, and that's a huge difference. You're off by a ton in your spreadsheets, even though in principle, you were correct. You knew that he was a very big risk. So for me, it's more just marking the guys who are big risks, moving them down on your rankings. And then, like you said, certainly you want to think about the overall risk on your roster. Although I do wonder, maybe, is there some value to someone saying in a certain draft room, everybody's scared to take any risks in this draft room. So clearly the way to get marginal value here is just be the person willing to do it. I think that that's not something that I've found myself doing ever, just, taking all of the risks in one, and it's probably not going to work, and I wouldn't advocate doing it. Although I wouldn't completely rule it out if it was just one of those rooms where, man, all these guys are following way more than they should, and I don't even need them all to stay healthy, and I still have a really good team. So I'm mostly trying to limit the overall risk and trying to be not particularly precise about it, just making sure I don't end up with too much too early. I mean, once you get late, it's totally fine. I wouldn't even think about risk after round 20, maybe even after round 15. But in the early picks, it's about opportunity costs as much as anything. It's if you draft a pitcher who gets hurt in the 3rd round, then everyone else in your league has a 3rd round hitter and you didn't get one. So I want to avoid those, but I'm not doing it in a formalized way where I'm seeing exactly where I should draft them. It's much more playing it by ear.
Oh, by the way, this I have to make a Jeff Zimmerman disclaimer because he always gets a bugaboo when we say the word risk. Risk in general is up or down. We're talking about downside risk here.
Yes.
All right. Okay. So I hope I satisfied Jeff Zimmerman here. Don't kill me, Jeff. But yes, risk would be talking both positive and negative. We're talking about more downside risk here. You
avoid all upside risk at all costs.
Yeah. Right. And of course, there are different types of risks, and of course, it's much harder to quantify that than just projections, which really state true talent of a player. Because there's injury risk, there's also performance risk. This guy had a great year last year. Will he regress or not? That's a risk, right? But the injury risk, is this guy going to go to 0? That's totally different. Ruvain, what are you doing?
Well, I think when it comes to risk, I knock it down to between I mix it up between hitters and pitchers. Pitchers have a risk of inherently getting hurt. That's whether they're going to play or not. That's what it comes down to. Pitchers tend to get injured at a higher rate than hitters. Hitters, the more risk you have is whether or not they're going to live up to their projections. So that's the risk you're taking with that. So I'm willing more to take a risk with hitters earlier on. I'll take risk with the pitchers later on because I'll spend less capital on them. I'd rather have more hitting stats and a higher risk for the hitters, and I probably won't even take anyone with even a risky within the first 10 rounds because I do want to have that base. And usually the first 10 rounds you get 6 or 7 hitters, you get 1 or 2 pitchers, maybe get a closer there, so you have your base right there already. You don't necessarily need to take a risk there. Where you want to take the risk is the middle of the draft, because the middle of the draft is where the draft is won. Those are the players that usually have the positive risk. This is what you're discussing before, the positive risk, where those are the guys, if you pick right, those are the guys going to jump from a 15th round value to an 8th or 9th round value. And if you get 2 or 3 of those in the hitting category, and if you get, let's say, a 20th or 23rd round pitcher that jumps to a 16th round pitcher value or something like that, you probably have a better chance of winning, because that means that the pitchers are staying healthy. And again, that's a completely random thing, but listen, that's the risk. The risk, you should not draft anyone thinking about, I'm drafting this person, they're going to get hurt, I got to draft their backup. If you're drafting it that way, then you shouldn't be drafting the player at all, because why would you do that in the first place? So you're already planning for them to get hurt. That's not, you don't draft. People last year didn't draft Acuna and say, you know what, he's going to get hurt, so I need to have a backup for him. That's not the way it works. You have to draft based on your team and figure out that way. And I think when you split it between hitters and pitchers, I think there's 2 completely different types of risk.
So I'm going to add on some nuance to this discussion here, is that it actually, the risk that you're willing to discount or that you need to discount players actually matters what your goal is in fantasy baseball and how many leagues you're playing and what you're accomplishing. So, if you're playing in the NFBC and I call you a power drafter, take like Zach Waxman, okay? He plays in a lot of leagues, okay? Let's say he plays in 50 leagues. I think that his version of risk is going to be quite different than someone who only plays in one home league. Right, this is their home league, $100. That's all they do, because if you're only playing one league, are you going to want to take DeGrom in the 3rd round? Probably not, because if that falters, you're done. But when you have 50 drafts, you can take him at closer to his true value of projection, right, and worry less about the injury risk, because you're doing 50 drafts. You take Jacob DeGrom in 2 of them, and the other 48 you're not. Well, you couldn't get him at a cost because it's a much longer-term thing, right? Like for example, let me give you an easier case where you know exactly what the risk is. So, Eric, let's say you play in a mono league. You play in an NL-only league, okay? What's a closer that hasn't signed yet with a team that we think is going to get a reasonable amount of saves? Kenley Jansen, maybe?
Kenley Jansen.
Sure.
Is the best
Kirby Yates, I was thinking.
Kirby Yates, Kenley Jansen, right? Let's say Kirby Yates, assume he's, like a 25 save player, and in an AL-only league it amounts to like let's say a $14 player, okay? How much would you, if he's a $14 player, how much would you pay for him in an AL-only league? Or how much should he be worth, theoretically?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because he's going to be either worth 14 or 0.
Yes.
So if it's a 50-50, is the correct thing to say 7? You're wrong if you bid 7. You're guaranteed to be wrong, but you're going to be wrong in one direction or another. So I guess the correct answer is to estimate the probability that he signs there, and without any reason to believe that he's signing with a particular team, you call it 50-50 and call it $7.
Well,
it
but
just
right,
feels
but
really
the point
weird.
is, right, but the point is that if you're playing in one league, I wouldn't pay the 7. Because,
right, that's where I was going to go. Is
right.
I wouldn't do it. I think he might actually be valued there, but I haven't
right.
paid that price myself, so maybe I can't actually say.
But if you're playing in 50 leagues and you're playing in 50 NL leagues and 50 AL leagues, then I would pay the 7.
Yeah, that's fair.
Right?
Because you want shares on different players also, because you never know if you'll hit on one of them. You could say that also.
So Glenn Colton and Rick Wolf play in both AL Labor and NL Labor, and one time they said, you know what? We'll take Kirby Yates in the AL, and we'll take Kirby Yates in the NL. And since he won't go exactly at 7, he'll go at 6, 5, or whatever it is. They're like, overall, we're getting a bargain here, because we're going to get him in 50% of our leagues, and actually he will be good in 50% of the leagues. Like, it's a definite, right? 100% of the time he's going to be right and get the full value and get a huge bargain in one of them, right? It all depends what the goal is, right? If your goal is to win one of them, you say, all right, let's just stock up on those risks that I know are 50-50. Right, so the risk that you take, it's not just a one. Let me tell you, you should knock X plate appearances off of DeGrom, and you should knock $5 off his price. It really depends on how you're playing and what your whole construction is. But for the single player, single league things, you need to take a lot more off of the price because of that. And by the way, for the same reason, that's why the ADP of these guys in NFBC is much higher. Sale is third rounder. I bet you if you went to standalone leagues, Sale's ADP would not be third round because people are going to have to take a little bit more of a discount, and maybe they would drop to fourth, fifth round.
Yeah, to circle back in the how do you use ADP conversation, it's important to make the point here that ADP reflects the person in each draft room who likes that guy the most. It doesn't reflect the average opinion of an entire draft room. So the ADP isn't actually giving you, how does the fantasy community at large value all 350 of these players, whatever it is. It's just telling you when do you have to take him. And so certainly when you see somebody like Sale, as you were saying, what that ADP tells you is somebody in the room is probably going to take the risk at this point. It doesn't tell you that on average he's valued as a early third rounder or whatever it is.
That's
and another plug for NFBC is that on their website, besides having the ADP, they also have the range of the earliest they were taken and the latest were taken. So if you want to play chicken with their ADP and risk not getting the player that you want based on, he went this far in this league, you don't know you don't know what league that was in. You don't know if that league was early in the draft season, late in the draft season. So you can't really base it on that either. So there's inherent risk on playing chicken also.
Yeah, we didn't mention that at all, but knowing the min-max and the standard deviation of the player actually really helps a lot. If a guy has an ADP of 70 and his min is, min-max are 71 and 69, you can play the game of ADP chicken very differently than if his min was, 40 and his max was 120, right? So those are important numbers to actually look at besides the ADP. All right, and fantastic discussion. I do want to get into catchers. And before we dive into some of the ATC undervalued players, let's just talk about the player pool of catcher. Here's what I noticed, Eric, and you tell me if you see something differently. But for the catchers this year, I'm actually seeing prices and values and market both are very, very spread out. Like, we're seeing like mid to high $20 for William Contreras, but then you get one or two at the $20 range. You get some mid-teens, you get some low teens, upper single digits. Like, they're very, very spread out. And for me, what that means is that there's some value, there's some price at some point you can play. Like if there was a bunch of catchers that are bunched at a certain value, then you would be playing the hotspot game. And I'm planning my draft. I would say, okay, catchers in the 12th round, okay, those are some good catchers in the 12th round. I don't see that here. I see catchers as spread out. So you can basically just play, okay, this catcher went 2 rounds below ADP. That's the most I've seen. Grab him now. Okay, wait till this point at the $8 level. Okay, we haven't seen these kinds of bargains yet. Grab him now. I wouldn't plan for catchers this year based on what I'm seeing in the player pool because it's so spread out. Because you can just grab one everywhere. That's what I'm seeing. Do you agree, or do you have a different take?
Yeah, I think that checks out, and I would say it's spread out in a way that seems pretty typical, I would say, for the catcher position. There was a couple years where we were talking about all these young catchers coming up. We're going to change the position. We're going to stop thinking of catcher as quite so weak, that we're going to add, 5 or 6 young guys who are going to be studs for 5 or 6 years. And I think, some of those guys didn't quite take all the steps forward that we expected they were going to. Maybe we're going to talk about some of them, like, say, Gabriel Moreno. Is not a star yet. Maybe ATC still thinks he's undervalued. But guys like him, who it looked for a few years like they were going to be threatening that top tier, well, some of them didn't quite get there. Some of them only sort of developed, and then some of them really did. And I think we have a rather typical split from the top down to the bottom rather than more bunching up near the top like it looked like we might have.
Yeah, and I agree with both you guys. The only thing I'll add is that remember when you're dealing with the catcher pool, it's really league dependent on how many teams are in your league, whether it's a 10-team, 12-team, 15-team league, how you value catchers. But yeah, it's pretty spread out, and just keep in mind on how many catchers you need in each league because that can affect the value as well.
Yeah, I find that in two catcher leagues, catchers are usually undervalued. People don't include enough of a bump. But in single ones, they overvalue. They just don't realize that you don't really need a catcher. Like you can grab the worst catcher, and that's probably a better strategy. Especially in drafts where you can draft catchers in your 30th round, in the quote reserve round. In an auction, though, you do have to come away with a catcher in your auction portion, in your lineup. So it plays a little bit different. How do you value catchers, by the way, Eric? How do you do the bump up? Are you just looking at a value formula and doing that straight?
Well, I see the bump that the auction calculators tend to give to catchers is unreasonably high. It seems like if you're strictly following what the auction calculator, at least the one on Fangraphs, gives you for catchers, you're gonna pick one of the first couple catchers because Sal Perez is gonna float to the top of your board very early. And then for half the rounds, the rest of the draft, you're going to have catchers at the top of your board as well in a lot of rooms because I don't think the drafters necessarily go quite as strong as the auction calculators do. You were mentioning on your auction strategy episode that the year-end bump that catchers actually deserve is smaller than the year start bump that it looks like they're going to need, which I think is an interesting point there. You definitely got to bump up catchers, but I would caution against bumping them up just as far as it looks like some of those auction calculators say you need to do, because there's decent enough catchers, as you said. They're spread throughout the draft pretty well this year. As long as you have two mid-tier catchers you like and two late-ish tier catchers you like. I'm not sure I like many of them beyond about catcher 20. So like you said, in two catcher leagues, I do think you need to bump up a lot of them because you don't want to be stuck with the 27th, 28th catcher there. But as long as you just get somebody, maybe two somebodies by catcher 20 or so, I don't think you need to push them up that far.
Yeah, and I see that you have been listening to the show, and that's exactly right. The value bump at the end of the year isn't exactly the same as the preseason one, which looks enormous. And as I said with like the hitter versus pitcher split, when you're doing things, it's really about the market. If you want to optically mimic the market, if the market is only bumping up catchers $7, don't bump it up $10 because it'll look like catchers are incredible buys. And if you do only $4, it's going to look like they're incredible, they're terrible, don't buy any, but the market, that's wrong. You want to mimic the bump that the market gives, and that's usually somewhere in between of what a single catcher and a double catcher league will do.
And each draft is different because
Yes,
each
that's a
draft
great
will
point.
bump up, bump down, and you have to see where you fit on that. Do you want to be at the top? Do you want to you're saying, wait a second, why is Contreras dropping all the way to the third round, fourth round, fifth round? I'm like, wait a second, what's going on here? Is it something that I don't know? And then all of a sudden, a whole bunch of catchers go and they get bumped up. Then you realize, wait a second, if I wait a little longer, I don't need to pay that bump. I can get the catcher that I want mid rounds and something like that. So it's really league dependent and each draft dependent actually.
Yeah, I would say that the I call it the market premium. The market premium for catchers are not a year-to-year thing. It's not like, in 2025, we're seeing a market premium for catchers because everyone loves catchers. It's actually a draft-to-draft phenomenon. In some drafts, catchers people will go $2 over. In some drafts for this single year, they'll go lower. So it's the market premium is a draft-to-draft phenomenon, not a year-to-year phenomenon. It basically, to illustrate this point, if I said you can buy William Contreras in the 5th round, if I ask you that question, is that good or bad? The answer is you can't say yes or no. It really depends where the other catchers go. If the other catchers are going, the next catcher goes in the 11th round, well, then it's a crappy buy. If the other catcher goes in the 6th round, it's a supremely good buy. So it really, really depends on what the rest of the draft is doing to see whether you should value catchers. They're very tough. And again, that's another reason why I draft in the middle. I don't want to start, you come to the end. Do I get my catcher now? I don't know. Then I don't know how the market's reacting. If I am drafting in the middle in a snake draft, I have a much better clue to the market, and that actually is more important than pure value for a lot of this. So another reason.
And I think this year, that's going to make it really hard to draft William Contreras. Even if you like him roughly where the market has him, he's going, 2 full rounds ahead of any other catcher. If you're trying to draft catchers like the market, you just don't have an opportunity to do that with William Contreras, unlike, say, in an auction where his name comes up for bid and no other catcher's been bid yet, and you get to see what the market is because everybody's valuing him at the same time
and you
in
set
a draft.
The market. And you set the market that way.
And you can nominate somebody, someone in the middle of the catcher thing to see where the market bump is and to see whether Contreras is good to spend that high or not. So, absolutely. Let's go into the catchers. So, for those of you who are new to this program, we do not do, here's our top 10 catchers in order. We rank this guy. We don't do that here. There are other fine podcasts out there who do a better job than we do at player analysis. Exactly. Where we come to play is let's focus on the undervalued players according to ATC. I take the ATC generated value versus what I'm seeing in the market. Here's where potentially ATC could spot a value. And I don't listen blindly to ATC. It's not the gospel, but it does identify the potential. So we'll go through each player and say if we sort of agree with the fact that they're undervalued, we'll do a deep dive on, there. So if ATC is bubbling up 5-6 catchers, we'll just analyze the 6 and let's see if we can come up with a value for them. First one here is Salvador Perez. And before we even go into it, and Ruben and I have talked about in the show, is Salvador Perez for you a Hall of Fame catcher?
He is not, and I'm not going to say anything about his defense, which gets plenty of criticism and might keep him out of the Hall of Fame, but his offense doesn't clear the bar. He makes way too many outs. Salvador Perez, through the end of his 20s, had a .297 on-base percentage. He's actually gotten that up in his 30s. He's up at .303. If you let Salvador Perez into the Hall of Fame today, he would have the second lowest OBP of any player in the Hall, ahead of only Bill Mazeroski, who I think people will often cite as someone who probably wouldn't be in there with more rigorous standards. The lowest catcher OBP in the Hall right now is Pudge Rodriguez. He's all the way up at .334, so 31 points ahead of Salvador Perez. And, of course, Pudge played defense not bad at all himself. So Salvador Perez, while he's still a very strong fantasy option, stronger than ever, it seems like, based on the way he's being used, the amount of playing time he's getting at catcher. I think he's still a viable fantasy option, certainly. But even ignoring the defense, I don't think you could have an out rate of 70% and be a Hall of Famer.
But Ivan Rodriguez has the ballgorithm metric.
True.
You know what I'm talking about, by the way?
Yes, Eno Saris's ad. Maybe if he does an underwear ad. How are we back to nudity on this show?
Just remember who keeps bringing it up. That's all. Now, when it comes to Salvador Perez, in my opinion, he's not there yet. I mean, if you look at his statistics, he's got 9-time All-Star, 5-time Gold Glove, a World Series MVP, a 5-time Silver Slugger. But if you compare him, what I want to do is I want to compare him to the other catchers in the Hall of Fame right now. If you compare him to other catchers in the Hall of Fame, there are 18 catchers in the Hall of Fame. Only 6 of them have more home runs than him, but 11 of them have more RBIs, and 14 of them have more hits than he does. So if he would be there, he wouldn't be definitely not one of the top catchers. He'd probably be at the lower part of the level for the catcher. So I think he needs another 2, maybe 2.5 years of the way he's playing right now for him to get into the Hall of Fame. And then if he does that, then I think he'll get in.
Yeah, he's not there yet, but I think he does have the potential to get there. It's not like he's not making it. I think the book is not closed on him yet.
If the Royals were to win again while he's still there, I think he probably makes it just because of the narrative bump that a catcher would get. If he's a leader in 2 different eras of Royals teams who both win, I think he gets in. I don't know if it'll be deserved, but
yeah.
Buster Posey?
Is Buster Posey in the Hall of Fame?
I think so. I think he had much better numbers. I haven't checked his OBP, but I bet it's a lot higher than 303.
Remember, the Royals won in 2015, so if they win again,
I don't remember
this
that.
year, next
that
year, yeah, no, against the Mets. Thank you very much. But if he wins again this year or next year, that's a 10-year break and the catcher still being on the same team. I mean, that plays into some of the minds of the voters also, because sometimes the voters don't go by analytics or anything like that. That they go by what they feel or what they see. And if you see a catcher win a World Series in 2015, be the MVP, and he does it in not necessarily MVP, but wins another World Series 10 years later as the same catcher on the same team, that does carry some weight.
All right, so Eric, is he a buy for you? He's currently going very late 5th round, early 6th round. By the way, I should also mention that on the show, because we have to pick a standard, we're going to pick the NFBC standard in terms of roster construction when we give prices. 15-team league mixed, pricing. And when I give auction, I'm giving an auction equivalent price because I think in terms of dollars. But I tend to give both. But again, the format is 15-team mixed, just because I have to pick a standard. And if we have to talk about different formats, we will. But anyways, he's a late 5th, early 6th round ADP. His ATC, so basically it's like a $17 ADP. His current ATC value, which will be up soon, is going to be somewhere around 20. So he is a bargain. Do you agree with that? Are you interested in buying Perez?
So I have him as neither a bargain nor an avoid on my rankings. I have him right around ADP, so I think he's a fine option. The issue really is just his age. I mean, he's become quite a consistent source of decent batting average and good power and quite a lot of playing time as well.
Yeah, he DHs, so he's going to get a lot more at-bats than most.
Yes, assuming he stays on the field.
Yeah.
Yes, and that will help him stay on the field, but he's also 35. And even if he was just a 35-year-old first baseman, you'd have to worry about, is this the year where his OPS falls off by 50 points for no good reason other than just age? And I think that the market is more or less correctly balancing the extremely heavy workloads he gets, which are a positive, with the age problem here. I think that one thing we didn't talk about earlier in the risk section is year-to-year consistency. It's important, but there's just a very narrow window where you can have built up year-to-year consistency and you're not quite old yet. And unfortunately, I think Salvador Perez is no longer in that window. I think there were a few years where he was consistent and solid at a high workload. I just don't know how scared we should be that this is the year. I mean, I'm looking at the top 20, top 25 catchers or so. He's the oldest one on there.
Yeah. But I mean, he had a $24 season last year. I mean, he hasn't not had 23 homers in how many years? He batted .271. So I think last year was it wasn't an upside for him. Like he can be better, even better than that. But I think it was definitely on the high. It was higher than his true talent average. I mean, the 2 years before that, where he had fewer plate appearances, he was about a mid-teens value, which I think is closer to his average. So for me, I think that I value him somewhere between what he did last year and what he did the previous year, which gets me pretty much to the ADP. So I think I'm with you. I think the market is valuing him fairly. He's neither a bargain nor a bust. So I'm not, if he flips another round or so, yeah, I have no problem. And by the way, I think he's really safe. I think he's safe to amass at bats. I think his production is safe. I don't think any injury is fluky. He can bake age regression, and he's still going to have a very high floor. So to me, if you're buying him at around the $17 mark, which is where the ADP is going, give me another $1 or $2 discount off of that, and I'm buying all day. But I don't see him as a bargain above what the market is doing. Ruve?
Well, if you're saying he didn't have a career year last year, if you want to go by WAR, according to Fangraphs, it was his highest WAR last year. He hit 3.2 since 2013. So he's turning back the clock. This year he's going to be 35 years old. He's first base eligible also. Remember, last year he did play first base for a total of 49 games because Vinny Pasquantino was injured, so he did play more there. But he only caught 91 games last year. If he can keep that same workload and let's say catch 90 games and DH at 70 of the games, I think he can repeat what he did last year. The last time you mentioned about the 20 home runs, the last time he didn't hit 20 or more home runs, not including 2020, was 2014. That's 10 years ago. So he's been doing it pretty consistently. His career average is 267. Last year he had the lowest K rate since 2018. His highest walk rate last year. I mean, his walk rate went up last year. I mean, is he going to hit the wall? And if he will, I think the Royals are going to make sure that they get the most out of him, and getting the most out of him meaning may have him play catcher maybe 30 or 40% of the time, let his body rest, because they need that bat in the lineup.
All right, time for the Injury Guru's Trivia of the Week.
Okay, now this trivia question is going to be based on catchers because we're talking about the catchers, and then both Ariel and Eric have an idea of who one of the answers is going to be. But 4 catchers last year had 115 hits or more, 20 or more home runs, and batted over 240. Who were they?
Can you repeat that again? It's
4 catchers had more than 115 hits, 20 or more home runs, and batted over 240. Who were they?
Go first.
Eric?
So it's 240 with 20 homers. That's the key.
And 100 and over 115 hits.
Well, Sal Perez. Should we start
Sal
there?
Perez is one. That's he was the top of them. Yeah.
William Contreras.
That's number 2.
Some of these guys may have been injured too much. Did Will Smith probably got there?
Will Smith is a third on the list. That's correct.
And the other one is what we're going to talk about next, right?
The fourth one is what we're going to talk about. That's why I wanted to bring it up, because Logan O'Hoppe had 20 home runs last year in 136 games. My concern, his value seems to be very high according to ATC, and I like that. My concern is that the last 53 games of last year, he batted 196 with 6 home runs. His K rate went up a little bit. His walk rate went down, and his BABIP, he was lucky last year at a 318 BABIP. He hit in 2023. He had a 248 average with 14 home runs in 51 games. So there is upside there. He is going to get almost the majority of playing time there. I think they may DH right now because I don't know who the DH is out in Anaheim. I don't know who they're going to use right now. That depends on whether Pete Alonso ends up there or whatever happens. If O'Hoppe is able to play DH as well, he's gonna surpass the 20 home run mark again, and I think that's what you're looking for in a catcher nowadays.
I think the question to you, Eric, is in 2023 we saw him hit 14 homers in 182 at bats, and at that pace he would be over 30 home run player. And at that pace he would be a really good bargain. ATC projections has him at 23 homers. He had 20 last year. At that same pace from last year, he's pretty much at value what the market is. Question is he more like 2023 O'Hoppe, or is he more like 2024 O'Hoppe?
Yeah, if we want to throw maybe a little narrative on there as to why he might have really struggled down the stretch. That was his first full season in the majors. It looks like it was his highest plate appearances at any level by about 75. He debuted with 5 games in 2022, but 2023 was supposed to be his first full season, but he missed most of it with a shoulder injury, only played 51 games. So I think it stands to reason that down the stretch in his first full major league season, he would be wearing down, especially as a catcher. And I think I'd be willing to give him a partial pass for that poor stretch at the end of the season. And I think I really like Logan O'Hoppe. I think the thing that intrigues me the most is that in the minors, he was supposed to be, at least looking at the scouting reports, he was supposed to be hit over power. He was actually showing good power anyway in the minors, though. 26 homers in 104 minor league games back in 2022. But I'm looking at his strikeout rates were all quite good, about 16, 17% most of his time in the minors. That shot all the way up to just shy of 30% last year, but the power stayed. So if he stays as that guy, then he's not that different from, say, a Cal Raleigh, somebody like that, a very much power over hit catcher who we're totally happy to have on our fantasy teams. We know what we're getting. It's an incomplete package, but it's catcher. That's fine. I think O'Hoppe could still be that guy. But hey, what if there's potential for more contact here, a higher average? Again, he was down 16, 17% with that strikeout rate in the minors, 24% last year in 51 games, just shy of 30% this past year. If we get a full season of him down at even the 24% range, then we could be looking at a decent batting average along with a shot at 20 homers. So I think there's a lot of different ways that O'Hoppe's season could turn out to be quite a good one. I think for an age 25 player, I think that's a perfect time to be, dreaming a little bit on some upside. I wouldn't go crazy here, but I think the player he already is fine, and it's not hard to see him being more than that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that, what he did last year is on the lower end of his outcomes. He's more than a 20 home run player, and he's being priced as a 20 home run player. Here's my clue as to why I think he's a good buy. Where do you think he's going to bat this coming year, Eric, in the lineup? Is he going to bat 3, 8? Like, where's he going to bat?
That's a good question. Let's see what we have at RotoWire. We are projecting him to be 7, but
Yeah.
there's some not great hitters ahead of him and some rather injury-prone hitters. I mean, how long's Mike Trout going to be batting 3rd, for
Right,
example?
and
so I bet he starts 7th, but it easily can move up.
Right, and I was going to say roster resource on Fangraphs is putting him like 7th or 8th. What happened last year? Well, he started the season batting 7th or 8th. Somewhere in the middle of the season, he kept batting 5th. Somewhere down the stretch, he then kept batting 3rd. So I think that the projected at-bats are low. And this is a game of at-bats. If I told you that his at-bats were 10% low or 5%, or even 5% low, that projection shoots up another $2, $3. So I think the value comes from the playing time is more. I think that if you look at projections all over the place, they're actually projecting lower at-bats than he actually got this past year. And remember, this past year, he actually batted 5th and then 3rd towards the end. I think that's going to happen again. I don't think he's going to bat 7th and 8th in the order. He's going to end up being a middle-of-the-order guy, and that's just going to get more RBIs, more runs, more homers. So to me, this is a volume play. So the skill is going to be better than last year, where she's priced at, and the volume is more. That means he's a bargain. That's
But that lineup isn't that great to begin with. I mean, yes, he'll have more volume. He'll bat higher in the lineup. I assume he'll have more RBI chances. But he's not going to get no one's really going to knock him in after that. I mean, you're planning on Anthony Rendon having a healthy season and doing well. You have Joe Adele below him and stuff like that. I mean, I mentioned DH. They did sign Jorge Soler, so Jorge Soler is going to be the DH there. But if they can do something like a la Salvador Perez and have him play first base, or learn how to play first base, if they don't sign for another first baseman, then I think he can, get a breather or two there, and the catching season won't wear him down, and he won't get worn down at the end of this season.
Next, Francisco Alvarez of our New York Mets had 25 homers in 2023, only 11 last year. He was injured last year. It took him a while to recover. At the very end in September, he hit 5 homers in September, which is back to his old pace. To me, it screams Francisco Alvarez is just being, he had just coming back from injury. You can take his numbers last year and just say that's not him. And for that reason, I think he's a bargain. He's going about a $9, $10 auction equivalent, but he's worth a couple bucks more, even according to projections. And I think projections are light. Projections are going to have him somewhere around 21, 22 homers. I think he's closer to 24, 25. Eric, is Francisco Alvarez a buy for you?
So he has not yet been. So far, I have been out on him, but I'm glad you brought him up because I think I need to change that and at least become more in line with the market. I was talking earlier about how in these early drafts before ATC is out, I'm looking myself at the underlying numbers from last year and probably overweighting them. And I think Francisco Alvarez is an example where that is coming back to bite me. I'm looking at his 25% strikeout rate and a 6.7% barrel rate. That's not good. That's less contact than average and a worse barrel rate than average. Looking at some other players who looked similar to that on those two metrics, we're looking at Dalton Varsho, Jared Triolo, Max Schumann. And that was the type of hitter that Alvarez was, judging by the underlying numbers, or some of them, last year. But as you said, he was dealing with some injury, and he was much better than that over a full season the year before. The strikeout rate was the same, but the barrel rate was almost double. And so I think I'm penalizing him too much for a season where he wasn't necessarily himself that year. I don't know if we're going to get the fully actualized peak version of Francisco Alvarez yet. He's just 23 this year. He's a catcher. Sometimes it takes a while. It might not be for another 2-3 years before we really get him to be the player he's supposed to be. But I think that I am getting it wrong by ranking him too low and overemphasizing what really were some pretty unremarkable marks last season.
You've convinced one person here. I'm pretty sure you're going to agree, Ruvain.
Yes, 100%. And I think Eric hit it at the end, or the very end there. He's 23. He's only had 2 full seasons in the majors as a catcher. He's still learning how to deal with a pitching staff. And with the pitching staff that keeps changing over and over again, he's still learning. And one of the reasons why they didn't want to bring him up right away a couple of years ago is because they want him to get more learning how to be a catcher. So he's learning that on the fly. And you're trying to have him hit home runs. He may have been concentrating more on his catching skills and trying to frame pitches and stuff like that. But if you look what he did last year, his home run to fly ball rate last year was down, but he's also never had a season, except for last year, a full season, whether in the minors or majors, since 2019 of less than 22 home runs in a year. So if you know that he is a pure power guy, he's not going to get you that high of an average, but if he learns how to be a catcher and he's able to put that in his rear view mirror and he can just concentrate on hitting, then this is the year he can break out.
All right, so Gabriel Moreno is next on ATCCs as an undervalued by about $4, actually, so pretty significant. He's lower level than these other guys we mentioned so far, but a bigger bargain. The angle I want to go about here is he's not the power guy with some RBIs and, not the great average, but it's amazing power. He's the opposite. A couple of steals, couple of homers, not much. But the batting average is way above average, even for any position. How much does that count? Because, you're not expecting the batting average out of the position. Of course, it's a bonus, but you're also not getting anything else. Are you, do you need the superpower of batting average from a catcher to make him worth it? Maybe that's why he's being undervalued, or I don't know why he's being undervalued. He's, last year in a bad year, he had 266. His BABIP was 303, but he's usually like a 340 BABIP. I have him projected at 282 for a batting average, which was delightful. Maybe it's the lack of at-bats. Maybe Adrian Del Castillo is coming in the wings and people are fearing him end of the year. I don't know what the reason for the discrepancy is, but I just see too big a value gap in terms of the projections to market and seeing that, this batting average is going to hold because that contact rate is great. He had a 14.8% strikeout rate last year. That's going to have a huge floor for batting average. Whether he gets 5 homers or 9 homers, inconsequential, he's going to hold his value. Gabriel Moreno, interesting to you, or he not really?
I am on the not really side of things for now, and I think the reason why is when we're talking about these catchers who are batting average over power and really kind of batting average only. Not many of these guys are going to be average in steals like you get with a lot of average first players at other positions. The problem is their value can just collapse through no fault of their own. If it's a bad BABIP season, then okay, great. You had a 14% strikeout rate, but you hit, 240 or something. Look at Keibert Ruiz last year as a prime example of this. He had an 11% strikeout rate. He hit 229. Now, I think Moreno gets it on the ground more than Ruiz does, so we shouldn't necessarily expect quite that sort of collapse. But you say that there's a high floor with his batting average. That isn't necessarily a guarantee just because the way batting average works. And so if there's a chance that his value could just collapse through no fault of his own, you'd want also there to be a chance that he, way outperforms his value. I guess that could be through BABIP luck as well.
Not much upside.
You'd also,
I'll take that.
Yeah, you'd want to hope for some power upside. You'd want to be able to envision a future where he hits 280 and threatens 20 homers.
And is not.
And he just doesn't hit the ball hard enough for that. So I think you're just locking yourself into a guy who's fine. And there are teams where you should do that.
But if he's your second
excited.
catcher, like you're taking a second catcher and he's Gabriel Moreno, I don't know. So you're locking in. There's rules about second catchers. Just make sure it doesn't have a bad batting average. All right, well that fits the bill with him.
Yeah, he's not going to kill your team.
But if he's your second catcher, who's your first catcher? That means you're paying up really for the first catcher. Now, remember when he first came up, he came with Toronto. He came up with Alejandro Kirk. His batting average has been better than Alejandro Kirk for last year. Kirk hit 250 last year, and he has more home runs than Alejandro Kirk. And everyone thought that Alejandro Kirk was going to be the stud hitter. So I don't think you're losing anything with getting Gabriel Moreno even as your first catcher. There's nothing wrong with trying to get a catcher who will hit average and not so many home runs because he's only 24. He's only had 2 full major league seasons as a full-time catcher. Plus, he's had some injury issues the last couple of years where he spends a week or two on the IL here and there, and that can affect his production as well. So I think he's basically in the same type of boat as Francisco Alvarez, just minus a little bit more of the power.
How about Yankees catcher Austin Wells, who came on with 13 homers last year and only 350 at-bats? The batting average stinks, but again, this is a catcher. This is a guy that probably has maybe 20, maybe 23, 4 homers upside. Crappy average again, but again, this is for a very low number 1, high number 2 type catcher. ATC has it as a little bit over $2 type bargain, a couple rounds early. I don't know. Is Austin Wells any interest to you, Erik?
Yeah, he's definitely interesting to me because, in contrast to the guys we've been talking about so far, he has above average power and contact. You mentioned he only hit 229, and he does have a fly ball heavy approach.
Rate.
Yeah, only a 21% strikeout rate. That's not way better than average, but it's better than average. And you look at his barrel rate, 9.1%. Again, not way better than average, but it's better than average. There are only 5 catchers, I believe this is minimum 400 plate appearances or so, who were better than average in both strikeout rate and barrel rate last year. It's Austin Wells, William Contreras, Will Smith, Salvador Perez, and Ryan Jeffers, who I think is another interesting value in this range. If you want somebody who's going to give you a decent amount of power, and Austin Wells last year, his expected batting average was 242. That's not going to kill you from the catcher position. 229, his actual average wasn't great, but he's not someone with that high strikeout rate where you think he's guaranteed to hurt your batting average. I think there's a chance that he has a league average batting average and helps you in homers for a catcher. And he's young as well, just 25 years old, so potential for growth. I like a lot of things about Austin Wells.
Agree.
I'm a little lukewarm on him. I'm not so high on him, only because of the fact he's only had 1 full major league season under his belt. He's still learning the pitching staff, and just like the other catchers we mentioned also, I think that hurts a little bit. Plus, the lineup he's in right now is not the same. It's having Juan Soto there and having a bunch of other guys, that's great, but is Austin Wells going to bat cleanup this coming year? I mean, he batted cleanup for a good portion of the year last year just because of the way that lineup was constructed. Where is he going to bat in the lineup? I'm not guaranteed. There's no guarantee he's going to bat where he was before. Right now, according to roster resources, they have him batting 7th, which is fine. But to try to get the same production you had before, I mean, he was in a prime spot to get more RBIs and be in better hitting situations and stuff like that. So I think the lineup construction is going to be a little bit interesting to see where the Yankees put him. If they put him a little higher and utilize him that way, like they did last year, just because they go, let's go lefty righty, that type of thing, because he's a lefty, then I think he may have more value.
Last one is Luis Campusano of San Diego. This is a number 2 catching option, but he's really going for free, and he's worth something, is what ATC is saying. Last year, he had a bad year. He had batted 227 with 8 homers in only 277 at-bats. Not a bad homer pace, but he had a 240 BABIP. His contact rate was like around 87%, 13 or so percent strikeout rate. So there's a guy who absolutely underperformed last year, and his true batting average I have is worth close to about 260, which for a second catcher who's dirt cheap is great. And he can hit for a little bit of pop. He maybe can, if he gets 300 something at bats, we're talking double-digit homers. Not too shabby for your second catcher with a decent batting average, a little bit of pop. You could do worse than Luis Campusano, and he's, again, virtually free. Free is good. Anytime you have it free or close to free, it's going to be a high return on equity. What say you, Luis Campusano, yay or nay?
I think given where the price is, it's enough of a yay. I think you could see him as a budget Gabriel Moreno. I mean, really makes
that is exactly what I have in my notes, by the way. I have him. This is Gabriel Moreno light. That's my notes on him.
Exactly. So if you're looking for a kid who puts the ball in play a lot, I think you can wait till this range of the draft. The things that separate Moreno from Campusano, I think most importantly, is defense. Moreno's a fine defender. Campusano's a poor one. He's been on the threshold of claiming that job in San Diego, it seemed, for several years now. And I'm pretty sure the reason he hasn't is that his defense isn't great. He got poor grades as a prospect. His framing numbers look quite poor as a professional or as a major leaguer. So that might hold him back from the role you're hoping for. And the other thing is, it doesn't look like he gets the ball quite as hard. He also has a ground ball heavy profile like Moreno, but Moreno is close enough to league average hard hit rate, whereas Luis Campusano was quite poor there last year, 34%, up at 37.5 for his career. Not great either. So I'm a little bit curious why ATC would have him for the possibility of a respectable home run total when it doesn't have that from Moreno. I would project Moreno to have more of a chance at sneaking his way to 12 homers. I think Campusano, I mean, I guess he got 8 in 299 plate appearances last year, so maybe I'm underrating him here, but it sure looks to me like he hits the ball often, but not very hard, and tends to be on the ground.
Steamers got him for 14 homers, by the way. I mean,
that feels high.
It does.
And I think the main thing with him is he's going to get more playing time. Kyle Higashioka's gone. The current backup listed, according to Roster Resources and Fangraphs, is Brett Sullivan. Yes, they're waiting. They have the hot prospect coming up in a couple of years as the catcher who's like 16 years old, 17 years old, whatever he is now. But he's still a whiles away. And I think because Campusano will get more playing time, I think defensive side, I think he'll get more. You get a little bit more than you did last year. I think it's going to be better. Also, there's an interesting, his splits on the home and the road were pretty stark. He was a much better road hitter than he was at home. So that's something interesting. If you're playing, let's say, a daily league and you see that he's on the road, maybe you want to play him instead of being at home. That's what it was last year. So I'm as a second catcher, I have no problem playing him, is because he's going to be the number one catcher in San Diego, I think, right now.
Yeah, it's just a function of the price that he just a value for where he's going. Nothing more than that. I don't expect much upside, but price is good. Two very quick mailbag questions. Governor of Givener asks, will Endy Rodriguez get any playing time this year with the Pirates? Bart is number one, and Kutch at DH does not seem likely. Depth charts at Fangraphs has him projected for 30% of the playing time. ATC's got him for about 230 at-bats. I'd say he's pretty non-relevant for anything but, let's call it, non-shallow mono leagues. Do you agree?
It's an interesting one. I mean, I forgot just how much playing time he got before his injury 2 years ago. He got into 57 games, 204 plate appearances. He didn't perform well, but if the Pirates were viewing him as somebody they were giving that kind of playing time to 2 years ago, it surprises me if he doesn't get a meaningful run at some point. But I don't think there's many formats where I'd want to draft him now. He has to prove that he can hit at the major league level and prove that he's going to play. So a very late draft and hold for now, but I'm a little bit less pessimistic about him at some point getting, 2 months of starts.
All right. O's observations. Angelos Novus asks, here's some catchers outside the top 25 most likely to start 2026 in the top 5. I'll just toss out there. These are not questions. These are just comments. And he says at the end, thanks and great show. Ivan Herrera, Adrian Del Castillo, Samuel Basallo. I've actually never heard of Samuel Basallo. Del Castillo looks like he could be something. And Ivan Herrera, ATC actually projects as a $2 value currently. So, he's actually good even for this year. Any thoughts on it? Ruven, you go first. Any thoughts on these guys?
Ivan Herrera, only because he showed that he could do something. He's the one I know most about. He's no problem with as your number 2 catcher. He'll play enough, he'll get enough batting at bats and everything like that. So to do that, but the other catchers, again, you mentioned them. Samuel Basallo, this is AAA from Baltimore. He's catcher and first base eligible according to Fangraphs, I guess. His problem is, where is he going to play? Is he going to take back up Adley Rutschman? Okay. Is he going to play first base and take bats away from Bryant Mountcastle? I don't think so. So I think he's a guy that the only path for him to have any value whatsoever is to get traded.
Yeah, I think that might be the case with Basallo, and the Orioles should be wanting to trade some of their top hitting prospects, so maybe he's worth a pick anyway. I think of those 3, I like Ivan Herrera the most, although I don't think he actually fits the brief because he's currently going 18th among catchers, at least over at NFBC. But with Wilson Contreras could be playing first base this year. Herrera hit pretty well in a limited role last year. I would certainly be targeting him. Basallo and Del Castillo both have the big bats, and they both have major defensive questions. But I guess that's not too different than Yainer Diaz. Yainer Diaz had real defensive questions, and he don't think he was nearly the same kind of prospect that somebody like Samuel Basallo is. So sometimes a catcher can just, since the offensive bar isn't very high, if you hit pretty well and you play more than expected, you make a jump. So maybe one of those two. Two other young catchers just to throw out there. Dalton Rushing could make the big jump, but he probably needs a trade as well. It's hard for me to envision him getting that trade early enough and playing often enough that he could be a top 5 catcher next year. Another catcher, young catcher to know, Moises Ballesteros in the Cubs system. He's MLB ready, also is a good bat, probably not a catcher, maybe a borderline one. He's a hit over power guy without much defense, kind of like Alejandro Kirk. I don't think that's the sort of player who's going to go all the way into the top 5, but he's somebody who could, if the Cubs are willing to put him behind the plate or carve out some playing time for him elsewhere, he could have a better than expected season for somebody who's off the radar right now.
Well, just so you know, late in the I think in the early 90s, there was a catching prospect. His name was Carlos Delgado. They took him out of catcher, they put him on first base, and he had a pretty good career. So some of these catching prospects that you hear about now, they don't actually make it as catchers, they make it in a different position. So just keep your eye out to see if they are playing other positions in the minors when they are playing.
Good point. Well, great stuff. Quickly, let's do the injury update with Ruvain. What catcher injury can you report?
Well, I think the question about the mailbag guy, talking about Andy Rodriguez, I think he was reading my notes before the show, because I want to talk about Andy Rodriguez to start with. The manager for the Pirates actually said that he is fully recovered for spring training and he should be good to go. He did have UCL and flexor tendon repair back at the end of December of 2023. He did make it to Double-A and did a rehab assignment at the end of last year. So he's interesting because if you look at the catchers in Pittsburgh, you're talking about Joey Bart and a whole bunch of other people. So you may be undervaluing his playing time, actually. Guardians catcher David Fry, who's eligible at catcher, actually underwent UCL surgery on his elbow in early November, which is very interesting because this means that he may not be available until June or July, and then after that, he's expected to be possibly DH only. So if you have him as a keeper and you're thinking he's going to be a keeper as a catcher, this year he'll be eligible at catcher, but next year he may not be eligible at catcher, so something to watch for. And 2 injuries that happened recently, they're not catcher related. Braxton Garrett actually had UCL surgery, and he is going to miss the entire 2025 season. And Alek Manoah, he said he hopes to be ready to pitch for the Blue Jays in August. He's aiming for the August return. He had a hybrid internal brace procedure for his UCL last June, and he's planning on throwing bullpen sessions in March, and hopefully to return to the Blue Jays. So if you want to if for some reason you have a deeper league, you have a lot of bench spots, he's a guy to think about.
All right. Well, this was a really jam-packed episode. Great strategy, great intuition about the catchers. I want to thank Erik Halterman from RotoWire for coming on the show and just doing a bang-up job. Thanks so much for coming on, Erik.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I'm excited to see you at the Tout Wars drafts in March. Hopefully, we will both be closed for our draft, but I guess we'll find out.
Absolutely. Why don't you just tell the audience where we can find you, hear you, read you, and all things Erik Halterman?
Yeah, I am found at rotowire.com. I'm the features editor over there. You can find my articles there. You can find me on the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball podcast once a week for now. It's going to be twice a week once the baseball season really gets going. You can also listen to me on SiriusXM on MLB Network Radio and SiriusXM Fantasy. Or you can follow me on Twitter at Erik_Halterman. That's Erik with a K.
Really great stuff. I really suggest you check him out. As you've heard him right here in the show, Erik is excellent. Ruvain, how about you?
You can follow me on Twitter, X, at MLB Injury Guru, where I tweet out injury updates as they come, and they should be coming much more so now that pitchers and catchers are coming up soon. I also have a weekly in-season article for RotoBaller discussing all the injuries for that week to help you pick up next week's roster.
And I'm Ariel Cohen. I'm over at Fangraphs. I'm over at RotoBaller. On the Twitter X machine at ATCNY, and the ATC projections are either going to be out when this podcast hits, shortly after, within days. You can download it at many sites, including Fangraphs and, of course, at RotoWire, as we mentioned before. Once again, thank you so much to Erik Halterman for coming on today's show, and from all of us here at Beat the Shift, we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Beat the Shift podcast presented by Fangraphs. Follow us on Twitter at beat_shift_pod.